new science fiction epic Life Force, based on a book by Colin Wilson, and the latest milestone in his extraordinary career. From humble beginnings in Leicester, Colin Wilson sprang to fame with his first book, The Outsider, deep study of the soul of man. It was hailed by the critics, and Wilson was quickly dubbed one of the angry young men of the mid-50s. He attracted a huge amount of publicity, and eventually, to escape the media interest in him, he moved to Cornwall, where he still lives today, surrounded by thousands of books and records. In 1971, he published The Occult, and found a wider audience and new fame. He's had a lifelong interest in the paranormal, crime, and world history. This interest, through his books, has ensured him a place as one of the most important writers of the 20th century.
Well, Colin, you've always struck me as a writer with something of a mission in life. How would you summarise that mission?
Yes, I suppose ever since I was a small boy, I've always seen things in a certain way. I've had a certain kind of vision, and I've always wanted to try to get this vision over. It's always seemed to me to be something extremely obvious, and yet, for some reason, most people just do not seem to see the world in the same way. I think that when I was very small, I always had these peculiar feelings of sudden, complete, total happiness, what G.K. Chesterton calls absurd good news. And there was always the feeling that it was so close and so easy that anyone could do it at any time. The American psychologist Maslow calls them peak experiences. And I was sure from a fairly early age that anyone could have peak experiences anytime they wanted just by turning the mind in that direction. Now, as soon as I began to read a great deal in my teens, I could see that most of the culture of the modern world is totally miserable and pessimistic. We seem to take it for granted that man is ultimately defeated and so on. And in a certain sense, all of my work has been an attempt to flow against that current.
So basically our brains have a lot more potential than any of us are actually using.
This is one of the implications of it. Our minds, we don't recognise how far that the mind itself completely controls our experience. So that, for example, since I've got interested in the so-called occult or paranormal, I've been completely astounded by these capacities of the human brain. For example, hypnosis can do the most incredible things. And we could do them ourselves. The hypnotist can say to somebody, let's say with a peculiar skin complaint, that will disappear over the next week, and indeed it will disappear. But you could do precisely the same thing yourself if you could merely, as it were, descend far enough inside yourself to give yourself the same order as the hypnotist.
Well, Colin, this is all based on science, and as a youngster you were actually more interested in being a scientist than in being a writer, were you not?
Yes, I started off wanting to be a scientist. I suppose it was the first sort of major direction of my life, to about the age of 9 or 10, when my mother bought me a chemistry set. From then on, I became completely obsessed by this notion that there was a vast amount of knowledge that you could actually absorb, and that once you'd absorbed it all, you could add to it. Einstein was the really great hero. I felt, that he had taken the most tremendous steps forward since Newton, and that, maybe with a little luck I could take a step forward from Einstein.
Einstein was one hero you would like included in your time capsule for posterity.
In 1905, an obscure physicist named Albert Einstein developed the special theory of relativity, the basis of the largest change in man's view of the universe since Isaac Newton. He ushered in the nuclear age with one formula.
E is equal mc square, in which energy is put equal to mass multiplied with the square of the velocity of light, showed that very small amount of mass may be converted into a very large amount of energy.
Very few people understood it, and nobody could foresee its implications.
Did you understand it or foresee its implications as a youngster, Colin?
I certainly wanted to work on the atom bomb. This was one of my great ambitions. I remember being tremendously disappointed when the atom bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and I realised, that I was too late, that I was only 14 at the time.
At that age, you wanted to work on the atom bomb?
Yes, very much. I knew that this was the next great possibility. The other great possibility at the time was the so-called electronic brain, what we now call computers, and they were invented about 2 years later.
As a young scientist, then, were you something of a school swot?
No, I suppose I did most of my so-called swatting at home. I wrote my first book on science at the age of 13. I tried to summarise all the scientific knowledge of the world in 7 volumes. And I wrote this during the long August holiday when I was 13 and then when I was 14.
What about the practical applications of science, the explosions in the back garden and things like that?
Yes, I used to love simply making stinks and explosions and so on with the chemistry set. But gradually this faded away, partly as a result of this attempt to summarize all world knowledge, because I got very interested in philosophy as a result of this, also in psychology. I was fascinated by Freud, and also in English literature. So I began reading an enormous amount of this kind of thing. And
again, any particular heroes, early heroes in literature?
Well, the man, I suppose, who totally changed my direction was Bernard Shaw. When I discovered the work of Shaw, he just seemed to me to be by far the most important writer the world had ever produced.
Why?
I'd never met anyone who seemed to see the world in the same way that I did. I remember listening to that third act of Man and Superman during the first week of the third programme on BBC, and being absolutely bowled over by it and going to bed feeling dizzy and thinking, my God, it is possible to understand the universe itself by means of the intellect. And this kind of vision that Shaw always had, I think, has always remained with me. I remain very much an optimist, as Shaw was.
So was that the turning point, then, that made you decide to become a serious writer?
Yes. What actually happened was that I left school at 16, partly because I hadn't got a high enough mark in the maths exam. I was offered a job back at school if I could actually pass the maths exam, so I took it again. But by the time I went back to school, I'd been reading Bernard Shaw non-stop, and I'd totally lost interest in science. So after something like a year as a lab assistant at the school, they discovered I was actually spending my time writing plays, and they sacked me from the job.
End of the first job. All this was taking place in Leicester. Was Leicester much of an inspiration for a young writer?
No, on the contrary. Leicester's a very pleasant town, and I like it very much now. Then I felt it was absolutely loathsome because it's slightly too big to be a comfortable, pleasant kind of town to live in, but not big enough to be like London or New York or somewhere where lots of interesting things are going on. So I left just as soon as I could and got down to London. You see, the trouble was I felt like a mouse on a treadmill. I felt that there was no way to escape from this sort of vicious circle of working for £5 a week and exhausting yourself by working for 48 hours a week and then having no energy left to write. What I wanted to do more than anything was just simply to stop work and be allowed to write.
And to achieve that aim, you literally got on your bike and pedalled down to London.
Yes, I went to London, and this was in the early 1950s, and decided that I'd actually sleep out on Hampstead Heath in a sleeping bag just to save money, which it did. I spent my days in the British Museum reading room because of a sort of romantic thing about people like Karl Marx and Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells who'd written their early books in the museum reading room.
Before we get on to the writing of that period, one thing you've asked for was the last tram ride in London. Now, why was this particularly significant?
Simply because London of those days was, in a way, I suppose, a much less mechanised place than nowadays, and a place that, for me now, when I look back on old photographs of it, is full of nostalgia. I was actually on that last tram. I remember all of us got slightly drunk and managed to stagger onto it. But also, I think, because we all felt that, in a way, this was the kind of end of an epoch, the end of this sort of older London. And in a sense, I can see in retrospect, we were right. It was a kind of watershed. I think it was a great mistake anyway to get rid of the trams, because they'd been forced to put buses back there where the tram lines were, you know, these bus lanes and so on, and I think the trams were a lot cleaner. But it really was a feeling, you know, that something had really finished.
The Soho scene was also a very important part of your life in London. What was that like?
Again, that great feeling of nostalgia, because in those days, the great thing about Soho was that there were so many little clubs and cafes where you could wander along, settle down for the evening for the price of a cup of tea and a sandwich, and just spend all the time there and meet people that you knew, talk away books, books. This was one of the things that really did happen to writers in Soho. They tended to talk books away instead of actually getting them down on paper.
Well, did many of them actually become writers, or were they just talkers?
No, some of them actually did publish books. I remember Paul Potts, who was a well-known poet, later had a bestseller about his life. And a great number of others actually did publish first books, and yet didn't tend to continue. And this was the deadly thing about Soho. I found that after I got my first book published, the first thing I did was to stop going to Soho.
Well, let's see if this particular film clip brings back any memories for you. Soho of the 50s. Was the place actually full of great characters like that, or is it just the film clips that makes it appear that way?
Oh no, it really was full of great characters. There was a shot there of the poetess Iris Orton reading her things aloud, and then, Dylan Thomas was a Soho habitué. Tommy Steele started off in a coffee bar there, playing a washboard. There really was.
Well, looking back on that now, it sounds glamorous. Was it glamorous at the time for you?
I don't know whether it was glamorous, but it was certainly a very pleasant sort of releasing experience. After Leicester, and that feeling that there was absolutely nobody around who was interested in ideas, to suddenly be among people who were happy to talk about ideas all day and all night was a marvellous experience.
So you were actually doing the writing many of the others were just talking about. How were you actually doing it? Because this is where the British Museum reading room comes in, isn't it?
Yes, I used to sleep on Hampstead Heath. I used to go down Haverstock Hill every morning and get breakfast consisting of bread and dripping and coffee in the cafe on the corner. They used to charge about fourpence for this. And then straight down to the museum, where I dumped my haversack in the cloakroom and then spent the day writing in there. I was writing my first novel, a thing called Ritual in the Dark, which was again, in a way, about visionary experience and also about something that had always fascinated me, the Jack the Ripper murders. One of the first things that I did when I went to London was to go and look around the ancient Jack the Ripper murder sites in the East End.
What do you find so fascinating about Jack the Ripper?
Oh, it was simply...
And murderers in general, really.
Yes, murderers in general. In the case of Jack the Ripper, my grandfather had been a child in the Whitechapel area as a small boy and told me about the Ripper murders, so naturally this fascinated me. My mother used to read true detective stories when I was small, so once again I got rather interested. And then later on, of course, it did seem to me that this aspect of human destructiveness is the opposite side of human creativity that's always fascinated me.
Well, at the time, surviving on cups of tea and bread and dripping, the poor writer, but then suddenly along came the outsider. Now, how was this born, this idea?
One Christmas day, having nothing whatever to do, the superintendent of the reading room, Angus Wilson, had borrowed the novel I was writing to look at over Christmas and see whether he thought it was any good. So having nothing else to do, I sketched out in my journal, I've actually still got the pages of it, notes for a book, The Outsider in Literature, and then a pretty detailed analysis of the book as it was actually written. I wanted to write about these characters in the 19th century who'd had sudden intense visions, like Van Gogh seeing that picture of the starry night, the whole sky turned into enormous worlds of light. This business of visionary consciousness, and then the next morning waking up and thinking, my God, what did I mean by vision? And the question, which was true, the sudden intensity that they experienced, or the feeling of dreariness and boredom the next day. So I wrote a book The Outsider, about these characters who had experienced the moments of visionary intensity and then felt that they couldn't live up to them, and the enormous number of them who had committed suicide or died of TB or whatever.
It's a massive work. One would have imagined it would take you years to write, but that wasn't so.
No, you see, I'd got all of the work done. I'd been thinking and reading about these characters for years. So, in fact, I settled down in the British Museum to write it in January 1955. I sent a chunk of it away to a publisher quite casually, Victor Gollancz, about 3 months later, and he wrote back and said, I like this, I think we'll probably publish it.
Which was very unusual for the time, surely, wasn't it?
Yes, probably was. And then when I sent him about half the book a few months later, he said, OK, we'll definitely publish this. So I knew that my first book would be published long before I'd finished it.
Were you surprised at the success of The Outsider?
Not really, because I didn't know enough about publishing to know that it was unusual. But in fact, what happened, of course, was that this was the period of John Osborne's Look Back in Anger, The Angry Young Men, and I woke up on that Sunday morning, went down with my girlfriend to the newsstand on the corner and bought the Observer and the Sunday Times and some other papers, and found these extraordinary reviews hailing the book as a masterpiece and so on. And of course, as soon as I got back home, the phone began to ring. I think I was on television that evening and on the radio the following morning and so on. And all the stuff about sleeping on Hampstead Heath immediately made a very, very good story for journalists. And so, quite suddenly, the whole thing exploded and took off. And then, of course, as there was Osborne and half a dozen so-called angry young men that they're involved in the movement.
Well, did you find yourself having to live up to or live down to the title Angry Young Man?
No, I got very tired actually being asked what was I angry about, because the answer was nothing at all. I was never an angry young man in any sense, except, when I got very irritated with people like Kenneth Tynan, who were leftists and thought I ought to be a leftist too.
As we can see, actually, from one of the clips that we're going to include in your time capsule, this is from the Monitor programme of around that time.
Oh, God, yeah.
They've been called everything from messiahs of the milk bars to the new intellectuals. Who are these angry young men? What have they in common, if anything? A number of them have set down their credos or their attitudes to life in a book called Declaration, a sort of mental bearing of the chest, a kind of Mein Kampf of the young. I spoke to 5 of these contributors. Colin Wilson, author of The Outsider, Kenneth Tynan, theatre critic, Stuart Holroyd, essayist and playwright, Bill Hopkins, novelist, and John Wayne, critic and novelist. Which writer in Declaration do you disagree with most?
I disagree with everybody in Declaration, with the exceptions of Bill Hopkins and Stuart Holroyd. With some of them, the ones who show a personal malice towards me, I obviously disagree with particularly. Tynan attacks me and Lindsay Anderson attacks me, although I don't think either of them have ever read a word I've written or understand what I'm getting at. And both of them talk some sense mixed with a lot of utter balderdash.
Well, I'd like to say Mr. Colin Wilson, but I don't think there's anything there to disagree with. It's like you're disagreeing with a ton of lead cotton wool.
And from that clip, I can safely assume that you didn't actually like each other too much. Is that right?
No, we loathed one another. And in fact, there was a famous row at the Royal Court that hit all the front pages the following morning when we actually came very close to blows.
Now, The Outsider was published and it met marvellous reviews from all the critics, except the Sunday Times did say it was the sort of book which people put on their coffee table to show that they were intellectual, but they never actually read it. Was there much truth in that, do you think?
That wasn't a review at the time. That was within, I should say, about a month, by which time it was obvious that people were already getting fed up with all this publicity about the angry young men. And yes, I think that an enormous number of people did buy the book out of curiosity or to leave around on the coffee table. I've never felt that, in a sense, the kind of thing I was trying to say in The Outsider has been understood.
What about the effect of this glare of publicity on yourself? Because suddenly you were thrown into the full glare, weren't you?
Yeah, I found it, in a way, a horrible, vertiginous experience. I particularly found the malice it aroused a bit upsetting. You know, if you went to a literary party and somebody came over to you and said, "I'm a better writer than you are," and so
and that really happened?
Oh, yeah, several times. And this kind of thing I found irritating. And so already I was thinking about getting out of London. And then, of course, there was this tremendous burst of publicity that happened when my wife's parents suddenly turned up. She wasn't my wife then. Turned up with a horsewhip, and her father stormed into the room and said, the game is up, Wilson. And they said that I was a homosexual and that I had 6 mistresses. And they'd somehow got hold of my journals that had my notes for Ritual in the Dark in, my first novel, all about Jack the Ripper.
And they'd taken them as fact?
Well, they'd simply misread the stuff that was in there. So I handed them the journals and said, take them away and read them. And anyway, by the time I finally got the police in to persuade them to leave, they handed over the journals to a newspaper, and we fled to, first of all, to Devon and then to Ireland, pursued by all the press, and this silly hullabaloo went on for a fortnight. By the time I went back to London, my journals had been printed in the Daily Express, and old Golanks, my publisher, said, for God's sake, get out of London, you will never write another book. And then the chap in the next room said, I've got a cottage in Cornwall that you can have for 30 bob a week. So we took it, and we were in Cornwall within 2 weeks.
So Cornwall really found you, rather than you found Cornwall. There was no special thing about the county which drew you there?
No, complete chance.
I just wondered, because it seems to have a sort of mystical quality. You've always been interested in mystical things.
Yes, but that came later when I began to get interested in the occult and the paranormal. But Cornwall does seem to be full of, I don't know what it is. It's something to do with the ground itself. I discovered accidentally that I could dowse. I went down to the Merry Maidens on the other side of Penzance with a friend who could actually dowse with a dowsing rod. And I said, I can't do this. And he said, well, show me how you hold it. So I held the dowsing rod in my hands like that. He said, no, look, twist the ends like that so there's a tension on the rod. Now try it. I walked between the stones and the rod went, oink. So I thought I'd done it myself by changing the pressure. So I walked back again, it went, oink. And when I'd done this about a dozen times, I realised the rod was twisting when I came near to certain stones, and that certain stones were far more powerful than others. And now I discovered this all over Cornwall, particularly where there are standing stones, which have obviously been placed there because this power in the ground is quite extraordinary.
As we can see.
Terrific strain on the muscles of the thumb. Look, there it goes. So, see, it's not water it's responding to. Now look, I'm holding it as hard as I can down. I forced it down then, look. See again? Now, as I come close to the rock, look, watch what it does. See, it goes twist backwards. When I come away from the rock, it goes forward again. So it's definitely not water, it's some sort of electrical force in the... Look, right backwards. See? I've actually known it to turn itself inside out.
Now, how do you explain that, Colin?
What seems to be happening is that a part of my mind, of which I'm not consciously aware, I think it's actually the right cerebral hemisphere of the brain, is picking up the forces and making my muscles twist so that the rod twists. But I consciously am not in the least bit aware of it. And this is what I mean by these peculiar powers. You see, it was the same as a child, getting these sudden weird feelings of sheer happiness in a sort of way they were coming from the other side of me. We all know how to do it. For example, if you're feeling sick, suddenly by thinking about something else and turning the mind in the right direction, you can stop yourself instantaneously. So this illustrates once again the kind of thing that I'm talking about, the peculiar power of the human mind and the fact that we could do all kinds of strange things if we could get deep enough inside ourselves.
And how do we do that, though? How do we fully exploit our brain and get deep into ourselves?
Well, you can learn all kinds of simple methods. I mean, as a writer, I discover this all the time. If I can actually relax deeply enough, I discover that something inside me begins to take over, and you can blow on it like a spark until the whole thing is blazing. And this, of course, is what is called inspiration. And it's something to do with that unknown part of me and the known part of me, the conscious part of me, which have to interact precisely and exactly. And I can begin to do it.
But the secret is relaxing, not concentrating on finding the answer, but just relaxing and letting the answer find you.
That is to some extent. In other words, Maslow's peak experience, which Maslow said couldn't be attained at will, I believe can be attained by deliberately relaxing the will.
Now, mankind has been trying to find the answer to various paranormal questions for hundreds, if not thousands of years. In 100 or so years' time, when we dig up your time capsule, will we be any closer to those answers, do you think?
I'm fairly certain that we're actually on the point of discovering some of the basic answers now. These things don't tend to happen over hundreds of years, they tend to happen overnight. Even since, for example, The Outsider came out, there's been an astounding change in human consciousness. At that time, the consciousness tended to be mainly political, so that most of my contemporaries were left-wingers and so on. You didn't get this fascination with yoga and the paranormal and all the kind of things that you get nowadays.
Your book, The Occult, has made you something of a cult figure, a world authority on the subject. Do you like actually that label of cult figure? Because it can also have dangers, I would have thought.
I don't know whether I'm a cult figure in that sense. I'm a cult figure, I think, in the sense that a small number of people always read my books and think they're important, and that most people don't read my books and don't think they're important. T.S. Eliot once told me that the right way to do it was to become known to a very small group of people and then to a larger group of people and then finally to the general public, if that ever happened. And he said I'd done it the wrong way around. I'd become known to far too big an audience suddenly. Now, in fact, I've been forced to go back to the beginning and do it the other way around. And it's happening very, very slowly. Maybe this film will make some difference.
Well, I mentioned this film. How about you, the angry young man of the 50s, the intellectual, the philosopher? Now you're suddenly wrapped up in this Hollywood tinsel town.
I don't know anything about it. I haven't even seen it yet. I'm told that the thing has been a tremendous success in Japan and so on. I don't know how far it has anything to do with the actual book. What I would love to do is to make films myself or to be allowed to script them. This thing I've had nothing whatever to do with. And while I gather it's technically brilliant, I think they had the special effects man of Star Wars and this kind of thing working on it. I'd like to be able to do my own effects.
Right. Hopefully it's going to be a big commercial success. Does a success financially, does that actually interest you at all? Do you really want to make a lot of money out of your writing, or is it purely to, again, get your message across?
I've always been stony broke. I've always had an overdraft at the bank because writers of my type don't sell enormous numbers of copies.
I'm sure many people will find that very hard to believe, though.
Well, it would be marvellous if, in fact, it made enough money to allow me to write exactly what I want to write for the next 10 years. That's what I would really like to do.
And what about the future projects now then, Colin?
Oh, I've got about 10 on at the moment. I'm writing 5 books, or, I've got 5 books planned at the moment. I'd like to do an enormous book about sexual outsiders, actual sexual misfits and the way that this has affected their minds and their creativity. We now know, for example, that Tchaikovsky was ordered to commit suicide, and this is something that I didn't really understand when I wrote The Outsider. Somebody once accused me of conducting my education in public. I feel, that this is indeed what I've been doing, and it fascinates me.
Well, a book like that, Sexual Outsiders, it's, you say you want to do it. How do you set about it, and how long is it going to take you?
You ask your publisher if he will pay you.
You want the money up front, you mean?
Yes, put the money up front to research it. And if he says yes, which he has, then you go ahead and do it.
Colin Wilson, the very best of luck with it. Thank you very much indeed.
What I remember next is a view out of the observation window, coming into Earth's orbit. I couldn't expose the world to what we'd brought back with us. I was determined to destroy them all.